Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Cole. I'm 34 years old and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I want to start by saying something that I've never said out loud before. Not to a friend, not to a therapist, not even to myself, really. For most of my adult life, I believed my mother was right about me. I believed her when she said I wasn't as smart as my sister. I believed her when she said I'd never amount to anything. I believed her when she sat across from me at Thanksgiving dinner, with a full table of relatives watching, and said, "Well, Jess, not everyone is meant to be successful. That's okay, honey. Some people are just meant for simple things." She said it with a smile. She always said the worst things with a smile. And here's what I need you to understand before I tell you the rest of this story. I didn't come here for sympathy. I'm not here because I want anyone to feel sorry for me. I came here because about 6 months ago something happened, something that I still can't fully wrap my head around, something that changed everything. And honestly, if you've ever had a parent who made you feel like you were a burden, like you were less than, like your dreams were somehow an embarrassment, then you already know where this story is going. Stay with me, because this one is going to take a minute to unfold, and I promise you, every single minute is worth it. Let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in a small town outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. Population maybe 12,000 people. The kind of town where everybody knows your business, everybody knows your family name, and everybody talks. My mother, Diane Cole, was, and I say this as neutrally as I possibly can, a woman who lived for appearances. She cared deeply about what the neighbors thought. She cared about what the women in her church group thought. She cared about what my dad's coworkers thought at the company picnics every summer. What she did not care about, not nearly as much, was what her daughters thought. There were two of us, me, Jessica, the older one, and my sister Amber, who was 2 years younger. Amber was the pretty one, the social one, the one who made friends easily, who got invited to every birthday party, who came home with perfect report cards without ever seeming to try. And I want to be careful here, because I don't hate my sister. This is not a story about hating Amber. Amber is, a real person who also grew up inside the same house and carries her own stuff from it. But there is a difference between loving your sister and pretending that your entire childhood wasn't shaped by the fact that your mother preferred her. Because mine was. I remember being 7 years old and bringing home a drawing I'd made at school. I'd spent all of art class on it, a little house with a garden and a family standing outside in the sun. I was so proud of it. I ran through the front door and I said, "Mom, look what I made." And she glanced at it, nodded, and said, "That's nice, sweetie." Then she turned back to whatever she was doing. 2 days later, Amber brought home a finger painting, streaks of blue and red and yellow, the way all 7-year-olds paint, and my mother literally framed it, hung it in the hallway. I know that sounds small. I know you might be thinking, that's just normal sibling stuff. And maybe you're right. Maybe I'm reading too much into a finger painting. But then there was the time I made the honor roll in 5th grade, and my mother's response was, "Good. Now let's see if you can do it again." And when Amber made the honor roll the following year, my mother threw a little party, invited the neighbors over, made a cake, for the same achievement. And this was just how it was, year after year. The scales were never even. The measuring stick was never the same length. By the time I was in middle school, I had started to believe that I was genuinely less than. That there was something wrong with me that I couldn't see. That Amber had been born with some quality, some light, that I simply didn't have, and no amount of trying was going to change that. So I stopped trying. For a while. High school was its own kind of complicated. I was quiet. I kept my head down. I had a small circle of friends who I still love to this day. two girls named Priya and Dana who, if you're listening, I want you to know that you literally saved my life during those years. But at home, things were getting worse. My dad, and I want to be fair to him too. My dad was a good man in a lot of ways. He worked hard. He never raised his voice. He was gentle with us. But he was also completely checked out when it came to the emotional dynamics of our house. He saw what my mother did. I know he saw it. But he never said anything. He'd give me these little looks, these sympathetic, helpless looks, and then he'd go back to his newspaper or his football game, and nothing would change. I used to think that was the cruelest part, not that my mother favored Amber, but that my father saw it every single day and chose silence. When I was 16, I told my mother I wanted to study business. I'd become obsessed with reading about how companies worked, how money moved, how people built things from nothing. I'd spend my weekends at the library reading books about real estate investment and entrepreneurship that were definitely not written for teenagers. I didn't fully understand most of it, but something in it felt like a door that was meant for me. I told her this over dinner one night. I said, "Mom, I've been thinking about what I want to study in college. I really want to go into business, maybe real estate." She put down her fork. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not an obvious, mean laugh, just a soft, dismissive little laugh. And then she said, and I remember this word for word, she said, "Jessica, real estate? Honey, that takes connections, capital. You have to know the right people. That's not really something that's realistic for someone like you." Someone like you. I was 16 years old, and my mother looked at me and saw a ceiling I hadn't even approached yet. I didn't say anything back. I just picked up my fork and kept eating. And I tucked that moment down deep, into a place I would go back to 1,000 times over the next decade and a half. Amber, by the way, announced later that same school year that she wanted to be a fashion designer. My mother's response was, "Oh, baby, you would be amazing at that. You have such natural style." I don't need to explain that one further. I want to pause here for a second, because I know some of you listening right now are probably thinking, okay, I've heard this kind of story before, and maybe you have. Maybe you even lived it. But here's what I need you to stay for, because what happened next is where this story stops being familiar and starts being something else entirely. Something I still don't have the right words for. So please, keep listening. Because the version of me that you need to meet, the one who signed the paperwork that ended all of this, she's coming. But she didn't arrive without the long road. And the long road is important. Stay with me. I went to college. A state school, not the fancy private university that Amber attended on a partial scholarship that my mother talked about for years. I worked part-time through all 4 years. I took out loans. I ate a lot of ramen and peanut butter toast, and I did not complain about it to anyone. I majored in business administration with a concentration in finance. I was good at it. Not in a showy way, not in a way anyone made a fuss about. But I understood it. The numbers made sense to me. The logic of investment, of risk and return, of patience and timing, it all clicked in a way that very few things in my life had clicked before. I graduated with a 3.7 GPA. My parents came to the ceremony. My mother took one photo of me in my cap and gown. Then she spent most of the afternoon talking to another family near us about Amber's scholarship and how proud she was. I drove home alone. My first job out of college was as a property management assistant at a small real estate firm in Raleigh. The pay was modest. Honestly, it was barely above minimum wage when you factored in my loan payments. I lived in a studio apartment with a broken radiator and a neighbor who played guitar at 2 in the morning. I loved that apartment. It was mine. I called my mother one Sunday and told her about the job, about how excited I was, about how I was learning the business from the ground up, working alongside people who had been doing this for 20 years, soaking up everything I could. She said, "That's nice, Jess. Are you making enough to pay your bills?" Not, "I'm proud of you." Not, "That sounds like a great opportunity." Just, "Are you making enough to pay your bills?" "Yes, Mom," I said. "I'm fine." Because Amber's been offered a position at that design firm in Atlanta. Did I tell you? It's a very prestigious firm, very well known. Her starting salary is quite good. "That's great, Mom." "She's doing so well, Jess. You should call her and congratulate her." I hung up and sat on my kitchen floor for about 20 minutes. Then I got up, made myself some coffee, and got back to work. The next few years were a blur of learning, saving, grinding. I moved up at the firm. I became a property manager, then a senior property manager. I started understanding the acquisition side of things, how properties were evaluated, how portfolios were built, what made a deal good, and what made it a disaster. I started sitting in on meetings I wasn't technically invited to, staying late, asking questions that made some of the older guys in the office uncomfortable. I was good at this. I was really good. I also started saving money with a kind of obsession that I now understand was directly tied to that 16-year-old girl sitting at the dinner table who was told her dreams weren't realistic for someone like her. I was going to prove something. I didn't know exactly what yet, but I was going to prove it. At 27, I made my first small investment, a duplex in a working-class neighborhood that was on the edge of a revitalization zone. I bought it with every dollar I had saved, a small business loan, and a prayer. I renovated it myself on weekends, learned to tile, learned to paint properly, learned to negotiate with contractors who thought a young woman in work boots didn't know what she was talking about. They were wrong. I rented both units within 6 weeks. The cash flow wasn't life-changing, but it was real. It was mine, and it was the first domino. During all of this grinding, all of this building, my mother was having the time of her life talking about Amber, Amber's design firm, Amber's apartment in Atlanta, Amber's boyfriend, who was charming and handsome and worked in finance. Every phone call home, every holiday dinner, every random Tuesday afternoon text from my mother was somehow always about Amber. About how Amber had bought her first car, a nice one. About how Amber was traveling to Milan for work. About how Amber was thinking about getting engaged. About how Amber. And then there were the times she talked about me. "Your cousin asked how you were doing," my mother said once. "I told her you were working in property management. She asked if that was like being a superintendent. I said, well, sort of." I bit the inside of my cheek and said nothing. Another time, at Christmas. "I was talking to the Hendersons next door. They asked about both of you girls. I told them Amber was doing wonderfully. She really is thriving, Jess. You'd be so proud of her. And for you, I just said you're keeping busy, working hard. I didn't want to get into a whole thing. Because my life was not worth getting into. But here's the thing about growing in silence. Nobody sees you doing it. Nobody is watching. Nobody is commenting or clapping or making a fuss. You're just out there, in the dark, putting one foot in front of the other, growing roots so deep and so wide that by the time anyone looks up and notices the tree, it's already too tall to cut down. That's what I was doing, and my mother had no idea. By the time I was 30, I had 4 properties. By 32, I had 11. I had quietly formed an LLC, Cole Property Investments. Nothing flashy, no press, no social media presence. Just a company, growing steadily, making good decisions, building relationships with lenders and contractors and local government offices who were watching neighborhoods change. I had hired 2 employees, then 4. I was not rich in the way people picture when they hear the word rich, but I was stable, building wealth, and, for the first time in my life, I felt genuinely, solidly okay. My personal life was quieter. I had dated, nothing serious lasting long. I had good friends. I had my work, which I loved with an intensity that probably said something about me that I wasn't ready to examine. I had a home I owned, a real home, a 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood I had watched transform over 5 years from struggling to thriving, because I and people like me had invested in it. I was proud of myself, quietly proud. The way you're proud when no one is watching, because no one ever watched. My mother still introduced me at family gatherings as my older daughter, Jessica. She does something in rentals. Something in rentals. I would smile and nod. My cousin would make polite conversation. My aunt would ask if I was seeing anyone. My uncle would talk about the weather. And Amber would arrive 20 minutes late looking perfect, and my mother's entire face would change, would light up, would soften, in a way it never did when she saw me. I stopped going to family gatherings somewhere around 31. I told myself it was because I was busy, and I was. But that was not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I was tired. Tired of performing okayness in a room full of people who had all absorbed, without question, my mother's version of who I was. My dad called me once after I'd missed Thanksgiving. He said, "Your mom is upset, Jess." I said, "Dad, I know." He said, She misses you." And I wanted to ask him, when did she miss me? When was the specific moment that she missed me? Because I had been right there in the same house, at the same table, in the same classroom, for 18 years. And I don't remember a single time she looked up and realized I was missing from a room she was standing in. But I didn't say that. I said, "Give her my love, Dad." And I hung up. Now we are getting to the part of the story that I need you to really sit with me for. Because this is where things stopped being about the past and started being about the present. Okay, so about 3 years ago, I brought on a business partner. Her name is Rachel. She's brilliant, methodical, aggressive in negotiations in the best possible way, and she became my closest friend through the process of building something together. Rachel had background in commercial real estate, and I had residential, and together we decided to expand Cole Property Investments into a full acquisition firm. We would buy portfolios. Not just individual properties, but groups of properties, sometimes from banks, sometimes from distressed sellers, sometimes from other investors who were ready to exit. This is where the money started to be real. Not rental income real. Build a company real. We were careful. We were meticulous. We did not overextend. We grew slowly and then steadily, and then, almost without either of us noticing, we were doing acquisitions in 4 states. I still had not told my mother any of this, not because I was planning some elaborate reveal, not because I was playing chess while she was playing checkers, as the internet likes to say. I hadn't told her because I had learned, long ago, that sharing good news with my mother was a uniquely deflating experience. She would find a way to either minimize it, redirect to Amber, or express surprise in a way that made it clear she hadn't expected anything good from me to begin with. I had stopped giving her the opportunity. And then, about 14 months ago, Rachel flagged a portfolio that a regional bank was offloading. 17 properties across 3 counties in North Carolina and South Carolina. Mixed residential, a couple of small commercial units, 1 multifamily building. The price was attractive. The locations ranged from strong to speculative, but on balance, it was a good deal. Rachel had done a preliminary analysis and she was excited. She sent me the property list. I opened it on my laptop at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with a glass of wine and a bowl of popcorn, which is honestly how I make most of my major business decisions. I scrolled through the addresses, and I stopped. Right there, on line 14 of 17, 412 Clearwater Drive, Raleigh County. I knew that address. I had grown up at that address. That was my mother's house. I sat very still for a very long time. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it would be easy to turn this into a triumphant story where I immediately saw it as destiny, as poetic justice, as the universe finally paying me back for everything I'd endured. But that is not what I felt. What I felt first was something that surprised me completely, a deep, almost physical sadness. Because if my mother's house was in a bank's distressed portfolio, something had gone very wrong in her life. And whatever she had or hadn't done to me, she was still my mother. She had raised me. She had fed me and clothed me and kept the lights on. She had, in her own limited and sometimes cruel way, done what she understood mothering to be. So my first feeling was grief. My second feeling, and this came about 30 seconds after the first, was something a lot more complicated. I called Rachel. "Hey," she said, "did you look at the portfolio?" "I did," I said. "What do you think?" "Rachel," I said slowly. "Property 14. "Yeah?" "That's my mom's house." Silence. "Oh," she said. "Yeah." Another long silence. Then Rachel said, very carefully, "Do you want me to pull it from the analysis?" And I thought about that. I really thought about it. "No," I said finally. "Don't pull it, just give me a few days. I need to tell you what I found out during those few days. Because the story of how my mother's house ended up in a bank's distressed portfolio is its own kind of heartbreak. What I pieced together, from a conversation with my dad, from some public records, and from one very uncomfortable phone call with my Aunt Patricia, who always knows everything, was this. About 5 years ago, my parents had taken out a substantial second mortgage on the house. The reason, as far as I could understand, was Amber. Amber, it turned out, had not been doing as well as advertised. The design firm had let her go during a round of layoffs. The charming boyfriend had, in fact, become a husband, but a husband who turned out to have his own serious financial problems that Amber only discovered after the wedding. There were debts. There were bad decisions. There was a business Amber had tried to start that hadn't worked, and my mother, rather than telling anyone the truth, had been quietly wiring money to Amber for years. Money from her savings, money from my father's pension, and then money from the equity in their house. She had never mentioned any of this to me, not a word. She had continued to talk about Amber's life as though it was flourishing, as though the trips to Milan were still happening, as though nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, she had remortgaged her house to prop up a narrative that had nothing to do with reality. My dad had gone along with it. He always went along with things. And now the bank owned more of that house than they did. I sat with all of this information for 72 hours. I slept badly. I ate badly. I thought about it constantly, on my morning runs, in the shower, staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning. There was a voice in my head that said, "Walk away from the portfolio. Remove that property. You don't need it. Find another deal." And there was another voice, quieter, older, very tired, that said, "You have been walking away your whole life." I want to be clear about something because I think this is important. I did not buy that portfolio as revenge. I want to say that plainly, because revenge is not actually what this is. What I decided, after those 72 hours, was that I was going to conduct business the way I always conducted business: professionally, fairly, ethically. I was going to buy the portfolio because it was a sound investment. I was going to treat every tenant in that portfolio the way I treated every tenant in every property I'd ever owned, with decency and clarity and respect. And if that meant that my mother, who had called me a failure in front of everyone she knew, who had dismissed my dreams at 16, who had spent 34 years managing her image at the expense of our relationship, if that meant she was now going to become my tenant, then that was not revenge. That was just the world working in ways that nobody can predict. Rachel and I finalized the acquisition 8 weeks later. I was now, officially, my mother's landlord. She didn't know. And now I have to tell you about the dinner. Because here's what I haven't mentioned yet. While all of this was quietly happening in my professional life, my mother had called me, out of the blue, about 2 months before the acquisition closed. She had called to tell me about a dinner she was organizing. A family dinner at the house. My grandparents' anniversary. They were celebrating their 65th, which is genuinely remarkable. The whole family would be there. She wanted me to come. I almost said no, but my grandmother is one of the people I love most in this world, and 65 years deserved to be honored, regardless of everything else. So I said yes. I drove to Raleigh on a Saturday afternoon and pulled into the driveway of that house, my mother's house, which was now, technically, also mine, and I sat in my car for a moment before going in. I smoothed my jacket, I took a breath, and I went inside. The house was full. My grandparents, beaming and beautiful, my aunts and uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in years, children I hadn't met yet, running between people's legs. My mother greeted me at the door with a hug that was warm in the way a performance of warmth is warm. She said, "Oh, Jessica, you made it. I wasn't sure you'd come. You're always so busy with your rental things." "I made it, Mom," I said, and I smiled. I spent the first hour of that dinner doing what I always did at family events, circling the edges, catching up with the people I actually wanted to talk to, holding my niece, who is 3 and perfect and has no idea what any of this is about. And then, as dinners with my family always do, it went sideways. We were at the table. The food was good. My grandmother had cooked, and she is extraordinary. And someone, I don't even remember who, asked what everyone was up to. What was new? The kind of question that at a normal family dinner is just conversation. At my family's dinner, it was an invitation. My mother lit up. "Well," she said, "Amber just got some wonderful news this week." Amber was not at the dinner, by the way. Amber and her husband were dealing with something. My mother had said vaguely that they couldn't make it, and I was starting to understand why. Her design work has been getting some attention online. She's building a little following. It's just wonderful. She has such a gift. Everyone nodded. My grandmother smiled. This was familiar territory. And then my Uncle Ray, who I have always loved for his genuine obliviousness, said, "What about you, Jessica? Diane says you're in the property business?" I opened my mouth. My mother spoke first. "Jess does property management," she said, with the specific gentle tone of someone who is explaining a minor tragedy with great compassion. "It keeps her busy. She works hard. Not everything turns out the way we plan when we're young, but Jess has always been very resilient." The table was quiet for a half-second, and something in me, something that had been sitting very patiently for a very long time, shifted. Actually, I said, and my voice was calm. I was calm. I want you to know that I was very calm. I run an acquisition firm, Cole Property Investments. We acquire residential and commercial real estate portfolios across 4 states. We closed just under $40 million in transactions last year. Complete silence. My Uncle Ray blinked. 40, wait, million? Yes. My grandmother put her hand to her chest and said, Jessica, honey. My mother was staring at me. I looked at her when I said the next part. Not to be cruel, but because I wanted her to hear it, really hear it, in a room full of witnesses the way I had been diminished in rooms full of witnesses my entire life. I have 31 properties under management right now, I said, and we're looking at further acquisitions this quarter. Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. My Aunt Patricia finally broke the silence. She pointed her fork at me and said, in a voice that was maybe 60% admiration and 40% reproach for keeping it secret, "Why didn't we know about any of this?" And I just smiled and said, "I guess nobody asked." My mother excused herself to the kitchen about 30 seconds later. I went and found her there, eventually, because I'm not entirely without mercy. She was standing at the sink, running the water, pretending to rinse something. I stood in the doorway. "Mom?" She didn't turn around immediately. Then she did. And she looked, I don't have a better word for this. She looked like someone who had just woken up in an unfamiliar room. Disoriented. A little frightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. Her voice was small. "Would it have made a difference?" I asked. She didn't answer. "Mom," I said, "I've been doing this for years. I've been building this for years. And I spent a long time being angry that you didn't see it. But eventually I realized, you weren't looking. You just weren't looking." She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were wet. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't." We stood there for a moment, the two of us, in the kitchen of the house I now legally co-owned through an LLC, and I felt the strangest thing. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even sadness exactly. It was something closer to release, like setting down something very heavy. I didn't tell her about the house that night. I decided it wasn't the right moment. The right moment came 5 weeks later. I had Rachel's legal team send the standard new ownership notification letter to all tenants in the portfolio. Standard practice. It outlines the new ownership entity, the new point of contact, and any updated payment instructions. It is not a dramatic document. It is not designed to be. My mother received hers on a Wednesday. She called me on Thursday morning. I was in a meeting when the first call came through. I let it go to voicemail. I was in another meeting when the second call came. I let that one go too. By the time I was free, there were 4 missed calls and a text that said, "Jessica, I need to talk to you. It's urgent. Please call me." I called her from my office. "Jess," she said, and her voice was different than I had ever heard it, stripped of its usual confident social performance. "I got a letter today from a property company, Cole Property Investments." I sat very still. "About the house," she said. "Our house. Apparently the bank. Your father and I had a loan, and the bank sold it. Jess, do you know anything about this? The company name is the same as yours." Quietly, I said, "Yes, Mom. That's my company." Silence. "What?" "I acquired the portfolio that included your house 8 weeks ago. You're one of my tenants now." The silence stretched out so long I thought the call had dropped. "Jessica." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You own my house." "I own the mortgage instrument on your house, yes. You and Dad are the tenants of record. Nothing changes day to day. I'm not here to disrupt your life, but I am the landlord now." She didn't speak for a very long time, and then, in a voice I truly had never heard from her, cracked open and entirely unguarded, she said, "I've been telling people you were doing rentals. Small things. I didn't think—" She stopped. "Mom," I said, and I kept my voice as level and honest as I could make it. "I've been doing this for years. You just weren't watching." She started crying. Not performative tears, real ones, the kind that come from somewhere genuine. And I won't pretend that didn't affect me, because it did. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry, Jessica. I don't know. I never meant to—" "Mom," I took a breath. "I'm not going to do anything to hurt you. I'm not going to raise the rent to something you can't afford. I'm not going to use this to punish you. That's not who I am, and honestly, it's not what I want." "Then what do you want?" she asked. And I thought about that. I really thought about it. "I want you to see me," I said. "I want you to actually see me. Not the version of me that you decided existed when I was 7 years old. Not the comparison to Amber. Me. What I actually built. What I actually am." She was quiet. "Can you do that?" I asked. Another long pause. Then, softly, "I'm going to try." I want to tell you what happened after that, because the story doesn't end on that phone call. Real life doesn't end on phone calls. Real life is messier and slower and more complicated than any single conversation. My mother and I didn't suddenly become close. We didn't have a movie moment where everything was healed and we started calling each other every Sunday and sharing inside jokes. Life does not work like that, and I would be doing you a disservice if I pretended otherwise. What happened was something smaller and maybe more meaningful. She started asking me real questions. Not, "How are you, honey? Everything okay?" with half her attention on something else. But actual questions. What are you working on right now? How does the acquisition process work? What made you decide to go into this particular market? The first time she called and asked me something like that, genuinely asked, genuinely listened to the answer, I had to actually pause for a moment because I wasn't sure I'd heard her right. My dad cried the first time I visited after everything came out. Not dramatically. He just hugged me in the driveway, tighter than usual, and said, "I should have spoken up more when you were young. I'm sorry." And that was it. He pulled back and wiped his eyes and asked if I wanted a sandwich, because my dad responds to every emotional event by offering food. I said yes, I'd love a sandwich. He made me a really good one. About the house. Let me tell you about the house specifically. My mother and father are still living there. Same address, same kitchen, same yard where my dad grows tomatoes every summer. The rent is exactly what it was under the bank's terms. I am not gouging them. I am not punishing them. I went through the property assessment myself when I took over the portfolio, and I found a few things that needed repair. A water heater that was overdue, some drainage issues in the backyard, a section of fence that had rotted. I sent a contractor, paid for it out of my operating budget, because that is what landlords are supposed to do. My mother called me after the contractor left. She said, "They fixed the fence. We'd been asking the bank about that fence for 2 years." "I know," I said. "I saw it in the maintenance log." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. It was not a big thank you, not an elaborate one, just 2 words, said without any performance attached to them. But coming from my mother, they might as well have been an aria. "You're welcome, Mom," I said. I want to talk about Amber for a moment, because people always ask, and it's complicated. Amber and her husband are working through things. They are in a hard season. My mother, to her credit, has stopped pretending otherwise, has started talking about it honestly, at least with me. Amber reached out to me about 3 months after everything with the house came out. She said she'd heard from my mom what had happened, what I'd built. She said she felt ashamed. I told her she had nothing to be ashamed about on my behalf. I told her that whatever had happened between us as kids, none of it was really about us. It was about our mother's choices, and those were not ours to carry. Amber cried. I think we both cried a little. We're not best friends. We probably won't be. But we had lunch last month, just the two of us, at a restaurant downtown, and it was okay. It was genuinely okay. We talked for 3 hours. We talked about things I don't think we had ever talked about as kids, because we were both too busy being positioned against each other to just be people who grew up in the same house. She told me she's going back to school, studying something different, something more practical. She seemed lighter than I'd expected. I told her I was proud of her, and I meant it. I think a lot about what it cost my mother to call me that Thursday after getting that letter. Because here's the thing about narcissism, and I want to be careful with that word because it gets thrown around a lot these days. But here's the thing about someone who has built their entire identity around a certain story. When the story changes, they have a choice. They can double down and deny, or they can crack. My mother cracked. I don't know what it took for her to do that. I don't know what happened inside her after she read that letter. I don't know how many hours she sat with the knowledge that her daughter, the one she'd casually dismissed in front of family for decades, the one she'd described as doing something in rentals, the one she'd compared unfavorably to her younger sister on hundreds of ordinary days. I don't know how long she sat with the knowledge that that daughter was now the one holding the deed. But she cracked, and she called. And for my mother, that might be the bravest thing she's ever done. So what's the takeaway? I know people want a takeaway. I know that's partly why you listen to these kinds of stories, because you want it to mean something beyond itself. You want it to be a lesson, or a comfort, or a vindication. Here is what I have for you. The years I spent being dismissed did not disappear because of what happened with the house. The dinner tables where I was made to feel invisible don't unhappen. The 16-year-old version of me who sat across from her mother and was told her dreams weren't realistic for someone like her. She still exists inside me. She still gets quiet sometimes, in rooms full of people who seem to have always known they were allowed to take up space. What changed is not the past. What changed is who gets to define the present. For most of my life, I let someone else hold the measuring stick. I let someone else write the first draft of who I was. And I spent years either trying to pass a test that kept getting harder, or, finally, just refusing to take it anymore. The thing about building in silence, about growing when no one is watching, is that you stop needing the applause. You stop needing the announcement. You stop needing the dinner party reveal, or the phone call where she finally says the words you'd been waiting your whole life to hear. You don't need it because you built something real, and real things don't require anyone else's permission to exist. The house, owning the house, that wasn't the victory. The victory was years ago, in a studio apartment with a broken radiator, on a Tuesday night at the library, on a Saturday morning standing in work boots in a property that needed everything, knowing exactly what needed to be done. The victory was all those years of doing the thing, even when no one was watching. That's the part I want you to hold on to, especially those of you who are in the middle of it right now, in the middle of being underestimated, in the middle of being compared, in the middle of proving yourself to someone who won't look up long enough to see. Keep building. Build in the quiet, build in the dark, build when you're tired, and the person who should be your biggest cheerleader is looking right through you. Build anyway. Because the day is coming when the measuring stick changes hands, and you're going to be so glad you kept going. If any of this hit close to home, if you have a family member who made you feel small, a parent who picked favorites, a home where you always felt like you were on the outside, drop a comment below. I read every single one. And honestly, just knowing I'm not the only one who spent years believing someone else's version of me, that means more than I can say. Thank you so much for being here. If you're new to this channel, welcome. You are exactly who this space is for. Subscribe if you want to stay, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. Jessica.